Well, New York is relatively limited in the way in which it puts direct questions to the voters where they make the final decision right there on election day. They're actually, so we're being asked to make law instead of elect representatives to make the law in our names. And so they're real important because these are final decisions one way or another. And some of the questions can be significant. Some of the questions that were being asked this time have the potential to be significant. And as you said, some of them are quite small. I remember one question I was asked to vote on was the purchase of some buses for schools up far north from where I lived, yet that was on the ballot. And so it's always a mix of different things. We don't have the same kind of system that California does, where people can put all these initiatives on there, but we still do get these questions put directly to us. That is correct. So when you see these ballot questions, they usually are about turning something into law or changing a law, or in one of these cases, establishing a right under the Constitution. And so they can be quite significant. And again, you are directly voting on them. The process through which they come on the ballot involves the legislature, but that doesn't change the nature of what it is that we as voters do when we get these questions. Well, the whole state goes through the process every 10 years, and everything is on the table in terms of both congressional districts and legislative districts. The state recently changed the process through which it did this in an effort to make it less partisan. So far, that effort does not seem to have worked, because the commission, I guess to make it bipartisan instead of nonpartisan, but the commission that was established could not come to an agreement on the initial recommended districts. And so they issued two maps, one the Republican map, one the Democratic map. So we haven't really gotten very far away from the partisan influence of this. This particular question, I have to say I'm a little bit confused by it, because it seems to go in two different directions. On the one hand, it establishes a limit of 63 Senate districts. The rationale there, as far as I understand it, and it makes sense, is that you can never get these districts exactly the same size in terms of number of citizens. So you always have to build in a little bit of wiggle room just to make it possible, even with the best intentions. And so that wiggle room is where some of the, for lack of a better term, political shenanigans can take place. Because if I can adjust this and hit right up against the 5% margin on one side, and then I'm going to play with this one on the other side. So if you're able to also increase the number of districts, each of which has this margin of error that you're allowed to build into it, you increase the possibility that you can play around with it. So I get the logic there. The other one that establishes, the other part of the question establishes a simple majority vote on the part of the legislature to approve these things when one party is in power, which the Democrats are in power now. So if that's the case, then what we normally would have is a 2/3 majority that would be required. That seems to go in the other direction to me, to actually allow more partisan influence, because if one party controls the legislature, then all they need is a simple majority to approve the redistricting. That would seem to strengthen partisan redistricting possibilities rather than weaken them. So I'm a little confused by that measure. It seems to be kind of working against itself a little bit. Well, I think both of them, and we can look at the elimination of the 10-day requirement for advance requirement for registration first, but both of them basically make it easier for people to vote. And both of them also put New York more in line with other states, particularly other states that are large and for lack of a better word, sort of more politically progressive. So they make sense from the standpoint of allowing more people to vote. Now, clearly, there's going to be a partisan view on this. Right now, the people who vote in our country tend to be better off and tend to be higher income. So that, all other things being equal, you would think might help the Republicans rather than the Democrats. The Democrats always look to bringing more people into the voting group as a way to increase their numbers. And so you could, from a partisan perspective, say, well, this makes it easier for people to vote. It'll help the Democrats, though. And so Republicans in recent years have historically been a little more suspicious or a little more cautious about these things, or sometimes a lot more cautious. And again, the explanation usually is, well, to keep voting more restrictive, that helps their party better. If we're able to kind of strip that away, I think these two measures simply make it easier for more people to vote. And they have been done in other states without a lot of problems, particularly the second one, question number 4, which is that anybody can get an absentee vote for any reason. You don't have to specify that you're traveling or you have to provide some sort of explanation for this. So that's something, again, that particularly during COVID, I think we found was quite handy. And it gets us closer to basically allowing anyone to mail their vote in, which is, again, what a lot of other states have done. And so I would see those two things as being relatively non-controversial, just from the perspective of trying to make it easier for people to vote. No, we're past that point. They're on the ballot. And so that decision will be determinative. I would expect those two measures to pass, again, in part because New York is such a blue state, but not only because New York is such a blue state. New York has been very restrictive about its voting, and we've been changing that in the last few years, I think, for the better. I mean, some of the ways that it was previously, particularly for people trying to vote in a primary, and the number of months ahead of time that you had to be registered in that party in order to vote in that party's primary was really just ridiculous, to be honest. So I expect this to pass. But I can also imagine right now, people are just so disgusted with politics and so turned off by the whole political process that they might think, I'm just voting no on anything about elections. I'm voting no on anything that has to do with the political system. And so I do worry about it from that perspective. Well, that's a great question, and it gets at one of the big problems right now that we're having as a country, which is political misinformation. And it's going to be hard to avoid here. So normally what would happen is the state would be providing some sort of basic primers on these. California does this, and the downside for California is they have so many complicated initiatives and ballot propositions that this is like 100-page book that the voters have to read through, and the print is small, by the way. But there should be some kind of advance information from the state explaining these things, and the state does that. Beyond that, if you're trying to figure out which way you want to come down on it, I would just say go off and do a sophisticated internet search looking for different points of view, but look at who those groups are, who's in them, what they represent, and be wary of misinformation about this, because there will be claims made. I mean, for example, on questions 3 and 4 about making it easier for people to vote, I can guarantee you that there's going to be a lot of information out there about how this is going to just blow up voter fraud. And you're going to get all this kind of voter fraud. A lot of that is going to be unsubstantiated. And so, people have to be wary of that kind of thing. There may be also claims that this is going to, make our democracy completely fine and guarantee the full health of our democracy. That's an overclaim as well. So you want to be careful about those kinds of things. Well, question number 2 establishes a right to clean air and clean water for people living in the state. And it is a good example of what makes the United States a bit different from a lot of other countries, because we are a very rights-based country. And because of that, then we are also more litigiously oriented. And you make a case, you take a case to court because you're asserting that a right has been violated, oftentimes. The concern I have about this is that clean air and clean water are rather vague terms. And by establishing a right to something like that, does invite people to bring lawsuits asserting that their rights have been violated. And so I think what that does then is it creates the possibility and the likelihood, it happens all the time in our country, where really big policy questions are determined by court cases and by the courts. And that may not be the best way that we want to think about what environmental policy in New York State should be. The other concern that I would have is that clean air and clean water are dependent on what happens outside of New York as well as what happens inside New York. And so to be able to bring a lawsuit in the state of New York asserting a New York-based claim for something that may be coming at you from outside the state creates another set of complications and issues. So this is a trend, I think, to establish different things as rights. But I think that political systems are generally better served by having that sense of what is a right limited to some really core things. You know, whether we want to put healthcare on there is a big question. So far in this country, the answer has been no, we haven't done that, but a lot of other countries have. And so, but when you start expanding it out to things like this, I think you invite some real problems in not only the legal system, but then the connection between the legal system and our policymaking process. Well, one reason is a lot of these elections are very local elections. So people are voting for their town boards, their supervisors, their mayors, and so on. For the day-to-day life that we as citizens lead, those folks are crucial, right? The things that happen to you every single day. The policies and the systems that we live under, whether we're talking about the quality of our roads, our sewers, the questions about schools, all of these things are really determined heavily at the local level. And so that's the reason why people should be looking at these things carefully. The problem is that these local races don't get a lot of coverage. And so there are limited means for people to really understand what it is that they are trying to decide on when whether we're talking about a ballot proposition or whether we're talking about a local race for a elected representative. And so that puts citizens in a tough spot because they're asked to make decisions on a number of different offices with very limited information. And I wish I had a great solution for you there other than multiplying our media by 4 or 5, but I don't beyond that. No, the only general thing I would say is I think there's a lot of anger and frustration out there right now among citizens. We've been saying this for years, but I think it's really probably higher than it's ever been in my lifetime. And so then that's the question is, how does that influence how people are going to vote on specific ballot propositions? Do they just say no to everything? Do they actually want to take the time to figure out what these things are calling for? How much do they trust even the description of what the ballot question is? I think those are all really big and interesting unknowns that we'll get more information about on election day, obviously.